I'd like to show you something in my pantry. And this might give you an idea what you can do with your freeze-dried food. Now right here, I have a couple of boxes, a couple of baskets of freeze-dried food. And this is food I use consistently in everyday life. We have some, for example, have some parsnips, and I have some peppers, and we have some green onions. We got some jalapenos, I believe, there. We have some cabbage. I got some ham, lots of apples, yellow squash. The point I'm trying to make, though, is that freeze drying is not just for long-term food storage. It should be used in our daily lives. Often when we're doing cooking, if we need something, we can come into this area and we can go ahead and use it. If we need a vegetable for a dinner, I have all this yellow squash that can be rehydrated. I even have back here freeze-dried breadcrumbs, and I bet you never thought about doing that, but freeze-drying breadcrumbs is a great way to keep them fresh throughout the years. Let's see what else we got back here. We have some green onions. I even have some blueberries. Now I use these quite a bit. If I'm making pancakes, I can just come in here, grab a handful of blueberries, and go ahead and throw them into the batter. Now I keep a lot of my food in Ziploc bags, and some of you that I've seen choose to use jars. Jars are bags that really doesn't matter. Now freeze-dried food such as this will last between 12 and 18 months in this type of environment. Now over time, some of this food will be soft. Let me see if I can find something here. Okay, so here's some onions. Okay, if I fill these onions, they're not as crispy as they used to be. They're getting soft. That's because moisture over time, and see now these were put in 21, so these are over a year old, but moisture eventually will come into these and will soften them up, and that's not a bad thing. So what I will do about every 6 months or so, I'll go through my inventory and I'll find those things, like these are some red bell peppers. If I find something going soft like these peppers or the onions, or let's see how the parsnips are doing. Parsnips are still pretty crunchy. Okay, yellow squash. Actually, the yellow squash is pretty good. What do we got down here? Okay, got some apricots. So what I can do, I can take a lot of this food and put it back into a freeze-dry tray and run it through the cycle a second time. And I can either reintroduce it back here in my pantry, or I can go ahead and bag it for long-term use. And so I think we'll do that. And here's some, okay, now here's a good example. Here's some tomato powder. Now tomato powder is hygroscopic, which basically means it has an affinity for moisture. So instead of being a powder, this is now in some like too big like dirt clods. So I can take this food and I can run it through my freeze dryer, and I can either reintroduce it into my pantry, or I can go ahead and put it in some Mylar bags with an oxygen absorber and put it into my long-term storage. But it's something you guys might want to think about is to have a small amount of food, freeze-dried food, that's available on an everyday basis. So I'm going to go through some of this stuff, and we're going to freeze dry it and see what we're going to do with it after that. I went through my pantry and I found some foods that were getting a little bit older. Most of this food is about almost a year old. The food is still good, but it's just not crunchy anymore. Over time, moisture has kind of set in. I mean, like my yellow squash will still break in two. There's a couple pieces that are kind of soft. My peppers here are really soft, so they're not snapping like they would if they were recently freeze dried. I got some blackberries, apples, which are really popular with my grandkids. They're almost like a foam rubber. So refreeze drying these will crisp these up quite a bit. I have some cabbage over here that we use a lot of, some beets. I have some onions that are also soft. Now, because the onions, well, because most of this food has very little moisture still, I don't have to really worry about the onions transferring the flavor to everything else. Now, the real interesting thing I have here is the tomato powder. The tomato powder is very hygroscopic, and it absorbed some moisture just like a sponge. It was almost impossible to try to cut this because the knife would not pass through it. So I virtually had to tear this apart. But in a quick cycle in the freeze dryer, this will become powder again. I also have some parsnips, and the parsnips aren't too bad. They still kind of snap in two, but I had a little bit of extra room, and so I added the parsnips. So I got 4 trays that I'm going to go ahead and put through the freeze dryer, and this is going to be quite an abbreviated batch because most of the moisture in this food is already gone. We don't have to really worry about freezing this to a really deep freeze and getting this rock hard. So the sublimation will happen almost naturally because of the low water content in this food. This was probably one of the quickest cycles I've ever done. It only took 12 hours to remove the moisture out of my pantry freeze-dried food. So I have my apples here. So the apples are now crispy again. They're nice and crunchy. So those came out really good. The blackberries, very crunchy. And my peppers, they snap now. All my yellow squash is back to being crunchy again. And my onions, which were really, really soft, are crunchy again. Now, my tomato powder is really dry, so I'm going to have to send that through the food processor and get this back into a nice powder. So, the yellow squash is probably enough. I could probably go ahead and package, but these other items here are going to go back into my pantry so I can use them on a day-to-day basis. The takeaway from this little video is that your freeze-dried food storage is not just a 10 or 20-year plan. It should be something you can use or have access to every single day. Now, if you take a look, you know, my yellow squash, we have a meal of yellow squash just about every day during the harvest period. But as we go into fall and winter, if I need some yellow squash for dinner, I just take a handful out, rehydrate it, and heat it up. Let's see what onions. My onions are nice and crispy again, and I use onions almost every day. I went ahead and ground up my tomato powder. Instead of being in those big dirt clods, it's now reconstituted. Well, it's now back to a powder that I can use in everyday cooking. And I also have cabbage, which we often use. I got parsnips. So all this food, now that's been refreeze dried, is going to go back into that section of my pantry where I have an opportunity to use it every day. Well, the takeaway on this, I hope you found this helpful, that there's more to freeze-dried food than a long-term food storage, and that you should be able to use it every single day. And if it gets, I don't want to say stale, But if it absorbs moisture in the next year or so, just run it through your freeze dryer again, and it'll bring it back to the state that you know and love. So I hope you found this video helpful. As always, please subscribe, and I will send another video your way. And thank you for your time.